Churchill, Manitoba, where winter winds can kill and polar bears rule the silence, Victor Lemaire was teaching his children the most important lesson of his life. He just didn't know it yet. The lesson wasn't spoken in words. It lived in the way his calloused hands, scarred from years as a water treatment operator, gently braided his daughter Maya's hair each morning at 5:47 a.m. It echoed in the patience he showed his son Lucas when the 8-year-old struggled with his boots, never rushing, never sighing. It was written in every deliberate action of a man who understood that precision and vigilance weren't just job requirements. They were the foundation of keeping people alive. "Papa, why do you always check the locks twice?" Maya had asked him the previous evening, her curious 10-year-old eyes tracking his nightly routine. Victor had paused at the kitchen window, his reflection ghostly against the darkness beyond. "Because some things are too important to leave to chance, little star." Now, as the weak January sun struggled against the horizon, Victor moved through that same methodical routine. Steam rose from his thermos of coffee, strong, black, practical. The radio crackled with weather warnings about the approaching storm system, but Victor had already read the signs in the restless wind and the way the neighborhood dogs had been acting. In Churchill, you learned to listen to what the land was telling you, or the land would teach you the hard way. 2,000 miles south, in a glass tower that scraped the Manhattan sky, Dr. Celeste Navarro had once commanded rooms full of executives with the mere inflection of her voice. As founder and CEO of Navarro Innovations, she had revolutionized renewable energy systems and accumulated wealth that could fund small nations. Her business cards were printed on paper so thick it felt like armor. Her signature was worth billions. But none of that mattered in the small cabin she had rented on the outskirts of Churchill, where she now sat by a wood-burning stove, watching snow accumulate against the windows. For 3 weeks, she had been Dr. Nobody. No board meetings, no acquisition reports, no endless parade of people who wanted pieces of her time, her money, her soul. The cabin was sparse, deliberately so. A single bed, a kitchen table scarred by decades of use, walls that bore the honest marks of weather and time. She had chosen Churchill precisely because it was the kind of place where billionaires didn't retreat, where the only networks that mattered were the ones between neighbors who looked out for each other, where nature commanded both respect and awe, and human ambition felt appropriately small. Celeste had been suffocating in New York. Every breath felt borrowed, every moment scheduled, every emotion calculated for its impact on shareholder value. The decision to disappear had been as sudden as it was necessary. One morning, she had simply walked out of her corner office and kept walking until she found herself booking a flight to the edge of the world. Meanwhile, Victor was loading his children into his truck, the heater battling against the -30 air. Maya clutched her science project, a model of the aurora borealis made from wire and colored tissue paper. Lucas had his sketchbook filled with drawings of polar bears and Arctic foxes, creatures he admired from the safe distance of imagination. "Will you fix Mrs. Henderson's fence today?" Maya asked as they drove through the quiet streets. "After I drop you at school," Victor confirmed. "The storm's coming tonight. She needs it secure." This was Victor's world, measured in practical needs and quiet solutions. He was the man people called when their water heater failed in February, when their car wouldn't start in the bone-deep cold, when they needed someone reliable. His reputation wasn't built on grand gestures, but on showing up consistently, without fanfare. January 14th dawned with a sky the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of snow. The air itself seemed to whisper warnings about the weather building on the horizon, but both Victor and Celeste felt drawn outdoors by different needs. For Victor, it was duty. Mrs. Henderson's fence had been damaged in the last storm, and leaving it broken would mean her small garden shed, containing her late husband's woodworking tools, would be vulnerable. Victor had promised to repair it, and his promises were as solid as the permafrost Churchill's foundations. For Celeste, it was hunger for something she couldn't name. The cabin felt too small this morning, too much like the comfortable prisons she had inhabited for years. She needed space, movement, the kind of clarity that only came from walking until her thoughts settled. She laced up her hiking boots, expensive gear that looked out of place but functioned perfectly, and stepped into the vast white world beyond her door. The trail she chose was familiar to locals, a winding path that followed the edge of the frozen river. It offered the kind of solitude that city dwellers paid therapists hundreds of dollars to simulate. Here, surrounded by snow-heavy pines and the endless expanse of tundra, Celeste could finally hear herself think. Victor worked methodically on the fence, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, each nail driven home with precision, each board measured twice. Lucas had insisted on helping before school, holding nails in his mittened hands and asking endless questions about why things needed to be built to last. Because, Victor had explained, kneeling to his son's eye level, when the storms come, and they always come, you want to know that what you built will still be standing. The morning stretched on, peaceful in the way that only remote places can be. Celeste walked deeper along the river trail, her footsteps muffled by snow, her mind finally beginning to quiet. Victor finished the fence repair and waved goodbye to Mrs. Henderson, who tried to press payment on him that he politely refused. Neither of them knew that their carefully separate worlds were about to collide in the most violent way possible. The sound came first, a low, guttural roar that seemed to rise from the earth itself. For a moment, the peaceful silence of the winter morning was shattered completely, replaced by something ancient and deadly. From the shadows of the dense woods, a massive polar bear emerged. Its fur was a mixture of white and brown, matted with ice and stained with the remnants of recent hunting. Its eyes held a terrifying blend of hunger and defensive aggression, and it moved with the fluid power of an apex predator that had never learned to fear anything. Celeste, lost in her thoughts along the river path, looked up to find herself facing a creature that belonged in nightmares. For an instant that felt like hours, the world seemed to halt. Time crystallized around her racing heartbeat, her suddenly shallow breathing, the way her expensive hiking boots felt rooted to the frozen ground. In that heart-stopping moment, her world narrowed to an instinctual desire to survive. Elsewhere in town, ordinary life was about to collide with extraordinary courage. The piercing cry for help reached Victor's ears like a blade cutting through winter air. A barely audible plea carried by the wind, so faint he almost dismissed it as the settling of old wood or the protest of ice against the riverbank. But Victor Lemaire had spent 34 years learning to read the language of Churchill's wilderness, and something in that distant sound made every nerve in his body snap to attention. He straightened from the fence post he'd been securing, his calloused hands still gripping the hammer. Years of living in tune with the unpredictable moods of nature had taught him that the Arctic didn't waste energy on false alarms. When the land spoke, wise men listened. When someone screamed in the wilderness, good men acted. The sound came again, raw, desperate, unmistakably human. Victor abandoned his tools where they lay, not bothering to set them down properly. Mrs. Henderson would understand later. He wrapped his worn jacket tighter around his body and began moving toward the source of the cry, his work boots finding purchase on ground he could navigate blindfolded. Each step forward was measured against an internal calculation: distance, terrain, weather conditions, the dozens of ways winter could kill both rescuer and victim. His mind raced with thoughts of Maya and Lucas, safe in their classrooms, but never truly safe in a world where predators roamed and emergencies struck without warning. The fear that had shaped every careful decision of his parenthood crystallized into a single, driving thought. If he could protect others, would he be better able to protect his children when their moment came? The question propelled him forward, past the last cluster of houses and into the tree line where Churchill's civilization met the raw wilderness. His breathing came in controlled bursts, visible in the frigid air, each exhalation a small sacrifice to the cold that seemed determined to steal the warmth from his lungs. What Victor found when he crested the small rise overlooking the river trail would stay burned into his memory forever. A woman, clearly not a local, her clothing too clean, her posture too refined for northern living, stood frozen beside the ice-crusted riverbank. Between her and any hope of escape, a massive polar bear advanced with the calculated patience of a predator that had never known defeat. The bear's shoulders rolled with each step, displaying the kind of raw power that could snap a human spine like kindling. Victor's hands found the sturdy shovel he'd grabbed without thinking, a humble tool that had seen many winters, its wooden handle worn smooth by countless hours of honest work. The weight of it felt familiar, comforting even, though he knew it was laughably inadequate against 800 pounds of Arctic predator. But inadequate tools had never stopped Victor before. He raised his voice in a clarion call of someone determined to fight fate itself, shouting words that were lost in the wind but whose meaning resonated clearly. Not today. Not on my watch. Not while I draw breath. The bear paused, its massive head turning toward this new presence that dared interrupt its hunt. For a heartbeat, Victor and the predator regarded each other across the snow-covered ground. Two creatures defending their territories, their purposes, their right to exist in this unforgiving landscape. The moment shattered when Victor charged. The ferocity that erupted from his compact frame belied his unassuming appearance. This was not the careful, methodical man who measured fence posts and checked door locks twice. This was something primal, paternal, furious, a father channeling every protective instinct evolution had gifted him. His first blow caught the bear across its snout, the cold metal of the shovel clashing against powerful claws as the creature reared back in surprise. The impact sent shockwaves up Victor's arms hardened by years of manual labor but still human, still breakable. Yet he pressed forward. The bear's roar filled the air, a sound so deep and violent it seemed to shake snow from the surrounding pines. It swiped with one massive paw, catching Victor's jacket and tearing through to the flesh beneath. Sharp gashes opened along his forearms, blood immediately freezing in the Arctic air. But he didn't step back. Cold metal clashed against claws again and again as Victor fought with desperate precision. His shovel became an extension of his will, striking at the bear's head and shoulders while he tried to position himself between the predator and the woman whose name he didn't know, but whose life had become his responsibility. The bear's next strike was more calculated, designed to end this annoying interruption permanently. Claws raked across Victor's side, opening a deep wound that painted the pristine snow with brilliant red. The pain was immediate, overwhelming, trying to buckle his knees and convince his body to surrender to the inevitable. But even as agony threatened to sap his strength, Victor's only thought was Celeste's safety. Not his own survival, not the children who would need their father to come home. Just the absolute necessity of buying this stranger enough time to escape. He swung the shovel with everything he had left, connecting solidly with the bear's skull. The creature stumbled, shook its massive head, and for the first time showed uncertainty about whether this particular meal was worth the effort. That hesitation was all Celeste needed. Her paralysis broke like ice cracking under spring sun. She stumbled backward, her expensive boots sliding on the treacherous ground, then found her footing and began running toward a cluster of stunted pines that offered the only available shelter. Her movements were clumsy with terror, but terror could be fuel when properly harnessed. The sound of approaching snowmobiles cut through the chaos, neighbors responding to the commotion, armed with makeshift weapons and the kind of northern courage that emerged automatically during emergencies. Mrs. Henderson rode the lead machine, a baseball bat strapped across her back and determination etched into her weathered features. The bear, now facing multiple opponents and nursing wounds from Victor's desperate assault, made the calculation that all wild predators eventually made. This hunt had become more trouble than it was worth. With a final, frustrated roar that seemed to promise future encounters, it retreated back into the depths of the woods, disappearing into the shadows as suddenly as it had emerged. Victor sank to the ground, his body finally acknowledging the trauma it had absorbed. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight began to ebb, replaced by an odd, surreal calm that seemed to disconnect him from his own injuries. Blood soaked through his torn jacket, staining the snow beneath him in patterns that would haunt the dreams of everyone who witnessed them. His vision blurred, whether from blood loss, shock, or the sting of wind-driven snow, he couldn't tell. But through it all, his eyes remained fixed on a point beyond his own suffering. The cluster of trees where a stranger had found safety because he had been willing to fight for it. Celeste crouched behind the pines, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with the cold. Her mind struggled to process what she had just witnessed. A man she had never met risking everything to save her life, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, simply acting because action was required. His eyes, blurred by tears and icy wind, fixed upon Celeste, now safely huddled behind trees. She registered both her near-death experience and the unyielding bravery of the man who had saved her life. The paramedics arrived with the efficiency of people accustomed to northern emergencies, their snowmobiles cutting precise tracks through the churned snow where Victor had made his stand. They worked with practiced hands, assessing his wounds while he lay on the makeshift stretcher, his face pale but his eyes still alert, still tracking Celeste's condition, even as his own blood soaked through the emergency bandages. "Sir, you need to stay still," the lead paramedic instructed, but Victor kept trying to lift his head, kept asking if the woman was safe, if anyone else had been hurt, if the children at the school had been notified of the bear sighting. Even semi-conscious, his first thoughts remained for others. At Churchill's small hospital, Dr. Morrison, a man who had treated everything from frostbite to industrial accidents during his 20 years in the North, shook his head in quiet amazement as he cleaned Victor's wounds. The gashes along his forearms would require dozens of stitches. The deep laceration along his ribs had come dangerously close to vital organs. The fact that Victor was conscious, coherent, and asking about school pickup times rather than his own condition spoke to what Morrison could only call improbable heroism. "Mr. Lemaire," Dr. Morrison said as he worked, "what you did out there, most men wouldn't have survived the first 30 seconds against a bear that size." Victor winced as the needle pulled through torn skin. Most men don't have children depending on them to come home. In the adjacent treatment room, Celeste sat wrapped in heated blankets while a nurse checked her for signs of shock and exposure. Her hands still trembled, though whether from cold or the memory of massive claws slicing air inches from her face, she couldn't say. Through the thin walls, she could hear fragments of Victor's conversation, his calm voice asking practical questions, showing more concern for disrupted routines than his own near-death experience. Word of the rescue spread through Churchill with the speed that only small communities could achieve. By evening, the incredible act had become the talk of every dinner table, every coffee shop conversation, every phone call between neighbors checking on each other's safety. The outside world took longer to catch wind of the story, but when it did, the response was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets from Winnipeg to Toronto scrambled to send crews north, their vans and equipment trucks looking absurdly out of place on Churchill's simple streets. Reporters with perfect hair and expensive coats stood in the exact spot where Victor had fought for a stranger's life, their cameras capturing tearful interviews with witnesses who struggled to put the morning's events into words. Mrs. Henderson became the unofficial spokesperson, her weathered hands gesturing as she described Victor's charge towards certain death. "He didn't hesitate," she told the cameras, her voice thick with emotion. "That bear could have killed him with one swipe, but he ran toward it like it was a house fire and someone was trapped inside." The contrast between this unwitting hero worship and Victor's actual nature became apparent the moment reporters tried to interview the man himself. He accepted no praise, no official honors, no invitations to appear on morning television shows. When cornered by persistent journalists outside his modest home, he would simply say, "I did what needed to be done," and then find ways to redirect conversations toward bear safety protocols and the importance of emergency preparedness in remote communities. Mayor Patricia Sinclair attempted to organize a formal recognition ceremony, complete with a key to the city and a proclamation declaring Victor Churchill's Citizen of the Year. Victor politely declined, explaining that he had fence repairs to finish and his children's parent-teacher conferences to attend. He vanished from the spotlight as swiftly as he had appeared, leaving frustrated reporters to fill their stories with second-hand accounts and file footage of the rescue site. But the community members who had known Victor long before his moment of fame weren't surprised by his response. They shared their own stories. How he had rescued the Kowalski family's dog during last winter's blizzard, crawling into a collapsed snow fort on his hands and knees. How he had worked 16-hour days to restore water service after the treatment plant's main pump failed during the coldest week of the previous year. How his kind eyes always held a glimmer of quiet determination whenever someone needed help, whether the problem was a broken furnace or a broken heart. "Victor's been our hero for years," explained Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store. "The rest of the world is just catching up to what we've always known about him." Old-timers at the Northern Lights Cafe would nod over their coffee when strangers asked about Victor's background. They'd mention his late wife, Sarah, taken by cancer when Maya was 6 and Lucas was 4. They'd talk about how he had never missed a school play, never failed to show up when neighbors needed help, never complained about the weight of raising 2 children alone in one of the world's most unforgiving climates. No story could capture the essence of a man who lived his life unsullied by the desire for recognition, Father Mackenzie observed during his Sunday sermon, though he was careful not to name Victor directly, knowing the man would be embarrassed by public acknowledgement even from the pulpit. Within a week of the rescue, Victor had returned to his familiar routines. He walked the familiar paths by the frozen river, not for any promise of accolades, but for the solace that nature provided to a man who understood its dual capacity for beauty and violence. His morning coffee ritual resumed. His careful attention to his children's needs continued unchanged. His quiet presence in the community's daily life picked up exactly where it had left off. Maya and Lucas saw none of the drama that outsiders tried to attach to their father's actions. To them, he remained simply the man who tucked them in at night, who helped with homework, who made sure their boots were properly laced each morning before school. The heroic deed was just one of countless sacrifices he made daily, no more remarkable to them than the way he always saved the last piece of dessert for whoever wanted it most. When reporters finally gave up and returned to their newsrooms in distant cities, Churchill settled back into its natural rhythm. Victor's story became part of the community's shared memory, filed alongside other tales of neighbors helping neighbors, of ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded it. Victor himself seemed most comfortable when the attention faded. He could be found in his workshop after the children were asleep, repairing neighbors' small appliances, preparing for the next day's responsibilities, living the same purposeful life he had always lived. Every step he took was silent testament to his belief that heroism is measured not by loud proclamations, but by quiet, steadfast love that inspires action in moments of peril. Dr. Celeste Navarro's recovery became a journey of physical healing and emotional catharsis that stretched far beyond the medical treatment she received in Churchill's small hospital. The stark juxtaposition of her tremendous public persona and the vulnerability she had experienced beside that frozen river created a cognitive dissonance that no amount of corporate training had prepared her for. In hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and northern pine, Celeste found herself replaying the rescue moment obsessively. She had built a career on calculated risks, strategic planning, and maintaining control over every variable that mattered. But when death had approached on massive pause, all her billions and business acumen had meant nothing. Her survival had depended entirely on the split-second decision of a man of simple means who had risked everything on an impulse of genuine compassion. The psychological impact proved more challenging to treat than any physical symptoms. Celeste had spent decades believing that money, influence, and strategic thinking could solve any problem. The realization that her life had been saved by someone who possessed none of these advantages, yet had acted without hesitation, forced her to question assumptions she had never bothered to examine. Dr. Morrison noticed her restlessness during recovery visits. "You're healing well physically," he observed, "but something's troubling you beyond the trauma." "That man," Celeste said quietly. "Victor. I need to understand who he is." What began as simple curiosity evolved into something approaching obsession. Celeste extended her stay in Churchill, moving from the hospital back to her rented cabin, ostensibly to complete her recovery, but actually to conduct her own investigation into the character of the man who had saved her life. Her first attempts were clumsy. She tried approaching Victor directly, showing up at his home with expensive gifts and offers of financial assistance that he politely but firmly declined. She attempted to schedule meetings, to express her gratitude formally, to find some way to acknowledge the debt she felt she owed. Victor would listen patiently, thank her for her concern, and then redirect the conversation toward practical matters. Had she filed the proper reports with wildlife authorities? Did she need assistance arranging transportation back to the city? Was her cabin adequately heated against the ongoing cold snap? Frustrated by Victor's resistance to direct contact, Celeste began talking to community members, piecing together a portrait of the man through the eyes of people who had known him for years. What emerged was a picture of consistency that bordered on the extraordinary. At the hardware store, Tom Bradley described Victor's approach to problems. "He doesn't just fix what's broken," Tom explained. "He figures out why it broke in the first place, then makes sure it won't happen again." Last year, when the Yamamoto family's furnace died during that cold snap in February, Victor didn't just repair it. He redesigned the whole ventilation system so it would run more efficiently. Mrs. Henderson shared stories from the perspective of someone who had watched Victor raise his children alone. After his wife passed, people expected him to struggle, maybe move away to somewhere easier. But he just adapted, made it work. Those kids never went without anything important, and they never doubted they were loved. The postal worker, Janet Morrison, offered insights into Victor's approach to community responsibilities. He volunteers for the emergency response team, helps with the community center's maintenance, coaches Little League in the summer. But he never makes a big deal about it. You only find out he's involved when you need something, and he's there helping. Father Mackenzie spoke carefully about Victor's character, respecting confidentialities while painting a picture of moral consistency. "Some people do good when they think others are watching," he said. "Victor does good when no one will ever know. That's the difference between performance and principle." These conversations revealed that Victor's heroism during the bear encounter was not an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of a life lived purposefully, guided by values that had never wavered despite significant personal challenges. Celeste's corporate transformation began subtly, manifesting first in her reaction to the daily business calls that still reached her even in Churchill. Conference calls about quarterly projections felt abstract, almost meaningless, when conducted from a cabin where she could see the site of her rescue through the kitchen window. Discussions about maximizing shareholder returns rang hollow when she was simultaneously learning about a man who measured success by completely different metrics. The shift accelerated when Celeste witnessed Victor's response to media attention. She watched him politely decline television interviews, refuse lucrative offers from book publishers, and turn down speaking engagements that would have paid more than most people in Churchill earned in a year. His consistent message, "I did what needed to be done," became a kind of mantra that challenged everything Celeste thought she knew about human motivation. "He's not playing hard to get," she told her assistant during a particularly frustrating phone call to New York. "He genuinely doesn't want recognition. How do you honor someone who considers being honored a burden?" The quiet bravery Victor had demonstrated reminded Celeste of extraordinary depths of the human spirit that she had forgotten existed. In boardrooms and corporate settings, courage usually meant taking calculated risks with other people's money. Victor had displayed a different kind of courage entirely, the willingness to sacrifice personal safety for a stranger's welfare, with no possible benefit to himself. Celeste began researching Victor's background more systematically, though she was careful to respect the community's protective instincts regarding his privacy. She learned about his work as a water treatment operator, a job that required both technical precision and absolute reliability. Lives literally depended on the systems he maintained. She discovered that he had put himself through technical training while working full-time and raising young children, completing his certification through correspondence courses and weekend workshops. Local business owners shared stories of Victor's integrity in their dealings with him. He never overcharged, never took shortcuts, never failed to deliver what he promised. His word was considered as reliable as a legal contract, perhaps more so. One conversation particularly stuck with Celeste. She was speaking with Maria Santos, who ran Churchill's small grocery store, when Maria mentioned Victor's approach to community responsibilities. True heroism often goes unnoticed, Maria observed. Victor's been quietly helping families for years, fixing cars for single mothers who can't afford repair bills, snowplowing driveways for elderly neighbors, tutoring kids who struggle in school. Nobody talks about it because he asks them not to. He says the help doesn't count if it comes with recognition attached. A reporter from the Winnipeg Free Press, who had been in Churchill covering the rescue story, offered his professional perspective on Victor's behavior. In 20 years of journalism, I've interviewed hundreds of people who claim to be heroes, he told Celeste over coffee at the Northern Lights Cafe. Most of them couldn't wait to tell their story to make sure I got every detail of their bravery right. Victor's different. His anonymity and humility speak volumes about character that can't be manufactured or performed. This observation crystallized something Celeste had been struggling to articulate. She began to understand that some of the noblest acts were performed without any expectation of praise, recognition, or reward. Victor's behavior challenged the fundamental assumptions that drove most human interactions, particularly in the corporate world where she had spent her career. Her determination to honor Victor's sacrifice without compromising the anonymity he clearly valued led Celeste to begin planning foundation work inspired by his example. Instead of public recognition that would embarrass him, she could create systems that supported people like him, individuals who made their communities stronger through quiet, consistent service. She began to understand that behind every public accolade lay the quiet sacrifice of an individual who believed doing the right thing was its own reward. 6 months after returning to New York, Dr. Celeste Navarro stood before the board of directors of Navarro Innovations with a proposal that would have seemed impossible before her encounter with Northern Courage. Leveraging the resources of her vast corporation, she outlined plans for the Quiet Heroes Initiative, a foundation dedicated to community safety initiatives in remote areas across North America. "We're not talking about traditional charity," Celeste explained to her initially skeptical board members. "This is about supporting local heroes who have contributed in silence for years, people whose work strengthens communities without fanfare or recognition." The Foundation's first initiatives targeted exactly the kind of infrastructure gaps that made places like Churchill vulnerable. Emergency communication systems for isolated communities, funding for volunteer fire departments, training programs for citizen responders, and equipment for search and rescue operations. Each program was designed to channel the spirit of that fateful day into tangible benefits for people who lived in the margins of national attention. Celeste insisted on operational structures that honored the values Victor had demonstrated. Grant recipients were chosen based on community nominations rather than self-promotion. Funding came with no requirement for public acknowledgement or corporate branding. The Foundation's work was designed to be felt rather than seen, effective rather than visible. "Too many philanthropic efforts are about the donor's ego," Celeste told her program directors during a planning meeting. "This foundation exists to strengthen people like Victor Lemaire, individuals who make their communities safer, stronger, and more resilient without expecting anything in return." The Foundation's reach expanded rapidly, identifying and supporting emergency responders in Alaska, volunteer coordinators in rural Montana, and community organizers in isolated parts of the Yukon. Each supported individual shared Victor's essential characteristic: they did necessary work without seeking recognition for doing it. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles north, Victor's life continued with the same gentle cadence that had defined it before his moment of accidental fame. His body bore the scars of his encounter with the polar bear, raised lines across his forearms where claws had torn flesh, a deeper mark along his ribs that would ache when storms approached. But his heart remained completely unburdened by any lure of public acclaim. His daily routines resumed their familiar rhythm. morning coffee while reviewing weather reports, ensuring Maya and Lucas had everything they needed for school, work that required precision and attention to detail, evening walks along paths that took him past the site of his confrontation with death, now marked only by the memory of blood-stained snow that had long since melted and been replaced. During late nights under the northern lights, Victor found himself reflecting on the events that had briefly thrust him into unwanted prominence. The aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, natural theater that reminded him daily of his place in the larger scheme of things. Heroism in its purest form, he had come to understand, was often cloaked in acts so simple they escaped headlines, the daily choices to help rather than walk away, to risk inconvenience for others' welfare, to value duty above personal comfort. Maya and Lucas had adapted to their father's brief celebrity with the resilience of children who had already learned that life could change unexpectedly. They were proud of what he had done, but more impressed by his return to normalcy than by his temporary fame. Their friends at school eventually stopped asking about the bear attack, and Victor returned to being simply Maya and Lucas's dad, rather than Churchill's famous hero. The ripple effects of that January morning extended far beyond Victor's personal experience or Celeste's corporate transformation. The Quiet Heroes Initiative began supporting countless unsung individuals across the continent. Volunteer paramedics in northern communities, retired teachers who tutored struggling students, neighbors who checked on elderly residents during harsh weather, mechanics who repaired essential vehicles for families who couldn't afford commercial service rates. Other communities began identifying and celebrating their own versions of Victor Lemaire, people whose consistent service had been taken for granted until someone thought to acknowledge it. The Churchill rescue became a catalyst for recognizing local heroes who had been hiding in plain sight for years. In Churchill itself, Victor's story evolved into an enduring legend that lived in the hearts of residents, shared not as an anomaly, but as a natural extension of the town's character. Newcomers learned about the bear rescue as part of understanding what kind of place they had moved to. Somewhere people looked out for each other, where courage was considered a normal response to crisis, where heroes preferred to remain anonymous. The story spread through word of mouth rather than media coverage, passed along by people who understood its true meaning. Teachers used Victor's example to discuss civic responsibility with their students. Parents referenced his actions when teaching their children about doing right without expecting reward. Community leaders cited his behavior when encouraging volunteer participation. Parallel reflections emerged in both Victor's and Celeste's ongoing lives, each transformed by their shared experience, but in ways that honored their fundamental natures. Victor found himself understanding that his actions had reminded him that every thread in the community fabric mattered. His rescue of Celeste became a lens through which he examined his broader responsibilities, not just to his own children, but to the extended family of neighbors and strangers who shared his commitment to mutual care. The lesson wasn't that he should seek out dramatic heroics, but that ordinary opportunities to help others deserved the same wholehearted response he had given when faced with life or death stakes. For Celeste, boardroom decisions became tempered by lessons learned on that frozen riverbank. Corporate strategies that had once focused purely on profit maximization now included considerations of community impact. Business partnerships were evaluated partly on their potential to strengthen rather than exploit local resources. Her leadership style shifted from command and control to something more collaborative, influenced by her observations of how Churchill's residents supported each other without formal hierarchy. Both had been fundamentally transformed by their encounter, but in ways that enhanced rather than altered their core identities. Victor remained the same careful, considerate father and neighbor he had always been, but with deeper appreciation for the significance of everyday acts of service. Celeste retained her business acumen and strategic thinking, but applied these skills toward goals that transcended financial returns. The bronze plaque appeared on a spring morning, installed inconspicuously near the outskirts of town where the river trail began, No ceremony marked its placement, no speeches or crowd gathered to witness its dedication. The simple inscription read, "In memory of quiet courage, a reminder that every act of love leaves a mark upon the world." Victor discovered it during one of his regular walks, pausing to read the words carved into metal that would outlast the people it honored. His reaction was characteristically understated. A quiet nod of acknowledgement, a moment of reflection, and then continuation of his normal routine. He neither complained about the attention nor expressed particular pleasure at the recognition. The plaque simply became part of the landscape, like the trees and rocks that marked familiar paths. Local residents began incorporating the plaque site into their own walking routes, not as a shrine to Victor specifically, but as a reminder of principles they all shared. Children learned to read using the inscription's words. Couples included it in their evening strolls. Visitors were directed there by locals who understood its significance without needing to explain it extensively. Sometimes the most profound acts of valor occur not in the glare of spotlight, but in quiet spaces between duty and desire, between fear and hope. 3 years after the rescue, Celeste's infrequent visits to Churchill had become a cherished ritual that marked the changing seasons of her transformed life. She would arrive quietly, without fanfare or advance notice, staying in the same modest cabin where her journey toward understanding true courage had begun. These retreats served multiple purposes: personal renewal, professional perspective, and continued connection to the place that had reshaped her fundamental beliefs about human nature. Her continued leadership of Navarro Innovations reflected a renewed empathy and focus that surprised longtime business associates. Board meetings that once prioritized quarterly earnings above all else now included discussions of community impact and sustainable development. Corporate decisions were filtered through questions Victor would never ask, but that his example had taught her to consider. Who benefits? Who bears the cost? What legacy does this choice leave behind? The company's stock price had actually improved under this more conscientious approach, though Celeste had learned to measure success by different metrics. Employee satisfaction surveys showed record-high scores. Community partnerships had strengthened rather than strained local resources. The Quiet Heroes initiative had expanded into 12 countries, supporting individuals whose work strengthened communities without seeking recognition. During these visits, Celeste would often stop at the Northern Lights Cafe, where Victor's story had evolved into local lore that newcomers learned alongside other essential information about surviving northern winters. The telling had been refined through repetition, stripped of unnecessary drama, and focused on the essential truth of what had happened. "He does what any good person would do," Mrs. Henderson would say to curious visitors, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug, without asking the world to know his name. The story was always told with respect for Victor's preference for privacy. Details that might identify him were omitted or generalized. The focus remained on the principles his actions had demonstrated, rather than personal heroics that would embarrass him. This discretion had become part of Churchill's collective character, a community agreement to honor their neighbor by protecting him from unwanted attention. Victor himself remained largely unaware of how frequently his story was shared or how deeply it had influenced others. He continued his daily routines with the same careful attention to detail that had always defined his character. Maya, now 13, had inherited her father's steady temperament along with her mother's artistic talents. Lucas, 11, showed signs of his father's mechanical aptitude and his innate desire to help others solve problems. The deeper understanding that had emerged from Victor's example extended throughout Churchill and beyond. Community members had developed a more sophisticated grasp of the difference between true heroism and performance, between service and self-promotion. Volunteer participation had increased, but quietly, without the usual competition for recognition that sometimes poisoned charitable efforts. Real courage, people had learned, was most often found in quiet decisions made in the stillness of ordinary moments. The volunteer who checked on elderly neighbors during storms. The teacher who stayed after hours to help struggling students. The mechanic who repaired essential vehicles for families facing financial hardship. These acts of service multiplied throughout the community, inspired not by Victor's dramatic rescue, but by his consistent example of doing right without expectation of reward. Victor's influence on others remained completely invisible to him, which was exactly how it should be. He had no idea that Tom Bradley had begun donating repair services to single mothers, inspired by Victor's approach to community responsibility. He didn't know that Father Mackenzie had restructured the church's outreach programs to emphasize anonymous assistance rather than public charity. He was unaware that several young people had chosen careers in essential services after learning about his work maintaining water treatment systems that kept the community safe. For Victor, each day continued to represent an opportunity to honor his commitments as a father, as a neighbor, as a guardian of the systems and relationships that made civilized life possible in challenging circumstances. The rescue had not changed his fundamental approach to these responsibilities, but it had clarified his understanding of why they mattered. His children had learned the most important lessons not from his moment of heroism, but from watching how he had handled its aftermath. Maya and Lucas understood that their father's strength came from his consistency rather than his courage, from his daily choices to prioritize others' welfare alongside his own family's needs. For Celeste, the rescue had become the cornerstone of both her personal and professional evolution. Corporate strategies that had once seemed sophisticated now appeared shallow if they failed to account for human impact. Leadership decisions were tested against standards Victor would never articulate but had demonstrated through action. Does this choice strengthen or weaken the communities we serve? Does it honor the trust people place in us? Does it contribute to the kind of world we want our children to inherit? Both Victor and Celeste had been shaped by their encounter into more complete versions of themselves, transformed by a lesson in humility and gratitude that had reshaped their understanding of what mattered most. Neither sought to replicate the dramatic circumstances of their meeting, but both carried forward the insights it had provided about duty, service, and the quiet satisfaction of doing right without seeking reward. The universal message that emerged from their story resonated far beyond Churchill's boundaries. The most extraordinary acts, people learned, were most often carried out by those who sought no reward, no recognition, no validation beyond the knowledge that they had done what needed to be done. The bravest souls were not those who strode into spotlights, but those who chose to walk away softly after crisis passed, leaving behind only a legacy of love, courage, and inspiration for others to discover and follow. Victor's example had become a quiet beacon for anyone struggling with the difference between service and self-promotion, between genuine care and performative concern. His story offered proof that heroism didn't require an audience, that the most meaningful acts of courage often occurred when no one was watching, and that the truest measure of character was found in choices made when recognition was impossible. The bronze plaque near the river trail had weathered 3 harsh winters, its inscription as clear as the day it was installed. Visitors continued to discover it during walks, pausing to read words that seemed increasingly relevant in a world that often confused volume with virtue, celebrity with character. In this frozen landscape where both nature and fate remained unpredictable, one man's resolve had shone through the darkness, lighting a path toward a future built on courage, compassion, and an unyielding belief that every act of kindness has the power to change the world. 5 years have passed since Victor Lemaire charged towards certain death to save a stranger's life, and the lessons of that January morning continue to resonate through lives he will never know he has touched. His story has become more than local legend. It has evolved into a blueprint for understanding what authentic heroism looks like when stripped of ego, publicity, and reward. True heroism, Victor's example demonstrates, operates in whispers rather than shouts. It emerges from character rather than circumstance, from daily choices rather than dramatic moments. The man who risks everything to save a stranger is the same man who checks his children's homework with patient attention, who repairs neighbors' broken furnaces without being asked, who maintains water treatment systems that keep entire communities safe. Victor's choice that frozen morning represented humanity's highest ideals, distilled into action. When faced with impossible odds, he calculated not his chances of survival, but his responsibility to act. When offered recognition afterward, he deflected attention not from false modesty, but from genuine belief that doing right required no external validation. When the world tried to make him a symbol, he chose to remain simply himself. The impact of his decision continues rippling through generations in ways both visible and hidden. Children in Churchill grow up understanding that courage is measured not by its audience, but by its necessity. Adults across the continent, touched by programs funded through Celeste's foundation, benefit from resources made possible by one man's willingness to fight a bear for someone he had never met. The power of authentic versus performative heroism has become increasingly relevant in an age when social media transforms every good deed into potential content, every act of service into an opportunity for self-promotion. Victor's story offers a different model, one where the most meaningful actions occur when cameras aren't rolling, when recognition is impossible, when the only witness is conscience. His legacy lives in the volunteer firefighter who responds to calls without seeking credit, in the teacher who stays late to help struggling students, in the neighbor who shovels driveways during snowstorms. It endures in boardrooms, where Celeste applies lessons learned on frozen ground to decisions affecting thousands of lives. It continues in small acts of daily kindness performed by people who have never heard Victor's name, but who embody his principles. The bronze plaque near Churchill's River Trail has become a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand what real heroes leave behind. Not monuments or accolades, but inspiration. Not fame or fortune, but the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. Not stories told about them, but strength found within others who follow their example. Victor himself remains blissfully unaware of his broader influence, which is perhaps the most heroic aspect of his entire story. He continues his rounds through Churchill, checking systems, helping neighbors, raising his children with the same steady devotion that drove him to face death for a stranger. He asks for nothing, expects nothing, seeks nothing beyond the opportunity to serve those who share his commitment to mutual care. In the end, Victor Lemaire's legacy endures, not in headlines or ceremonies, but in the silent understanding that when darkness calls, there will always be someone ready to step forward, fight the bear, and walk away without asking for anything in return. That's what real heroes do. That's what real heroes leave behind.